This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is joining me from Madison, Wisconsin, Levi Funk of Untitled Art and Funk Factory Gooseria. Welcome to the podcast, Levi.
Thanks for having me.
We've been enjoying Levi's spontaneously fermented and wild ale beers for a long time, and more recently, the really creative output from the Untitled Art brand that has kind of came out of nowhere and took our breath away with a few of these beers. Excited to have this conversation, talk about designing creative beers, about developing a palate, about understanding the flavors, about achieving interesting flavors in beers, and dialing in those right blends of flavors. I mean, heck, we've even really loved the Untitled Art hard seltzer, but I'm not going to push you too much on that because,
Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. We can talk about it because I think there's a uniquely flavorful aspect to the hard seltzer that you're producing. And, so appreciate that flavor forward approach that you take in all the beers that you make. We're going to dive into that. Before we do, nearly 2,000 breweries across the US, Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and a bunch more brewers you've heard on this very podcast all trust G&D to chill the beer that you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, haze for days in your IPAs. Carry Biohaze from BSG adds that perfect, stable, cloudy appearance for your hazy recipe. Made with all natural materials, Biohaze is a free-flowing microgranular powder that binds with protein molecules in beer that form polyphenol protein complexes to produce a cloudy haze. The unique product can be added to final beer to give your beer that famous haze. Find out more about Biohaze at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact them at 1-800-374-2739. So Levi, walk us through some of your brewing history, how you got where you are today, how the multiple beer brands developed, what drove your interest in getting into the beer business in the first place, and how'd you get to where you are now running two different beer brands?
Sure, yeah. I started off just being a consumer, drinking beers. Got a lot of people, a friend introduced you to craft beer, and coming from Wisconsin with New Glarus around, it was spotted cow was always an option and something that I drank, but getting really into craft beer happened later in life. And then from there, entering the world of trading and seeking out different flavors and different styles, and wanting to try the best or the highest rated examples of those styles. I think that part was pretty formative in developing an understanding for what made beer like an excellent example of that style, and appreciating different styles for what they are. And not everything has to be X bomb, right? In the US, we always want like bombs of flavors, but being able to understand what this style is and what makes that a good representation of that style. Then also forming an opinion of what styles I like and what styles I don't. I've never been a fan of like French saisons. It's not my thing.
Yeah.
And people have a hard time believing that I don't drink those. But it was through that, friend group of trading and trying beers and reviewing really formulated my beer palate, and was my introduction to sour beer and then to Belgian lambic. then learning about how those beers are made and not having any examples being made locally. So if I wanted to try a beer in that vein, it was usually pretty expensive to acquire those beers. Either if they were on the shelf, they're expensive, or if I'm trading for them or purchasing them overseas and paying for shipping, it was expensive. So was interested in seeing if those beers could be made in the U.S. just as a theoretical, like how would this look like, or what would be required, and then and also seeing some of the American breweries early on, like the Russian Rivers and the Allagash, who were the Lost Abbey was big back then too, in making sour beers and starting to dabble into spontaneous.
Right.
At that time, in the U.S., a sour beer was only good for as much acidity as it had. So
Sure.
the bigger the sour bomb it was, the better it was perceived. And I didn't really agree with that. I didn't care for the rip your teeth apart sour beers.
Right.
And much preferred the balanced, nuanced sours. So as I was looking into how this could look like in the U.S., both from a logistical and operations standpoint, but also a legal standpoint for doing a blendery, not a brewery. I had to talk to TTB, talk to the state, finally kind of figured it out and messed around with a barrel in my basement, a couple barrels. And then it was from there I got teamed up with a local brewery for a few years and started doing spontaneous beer up there. And then
I remember some of those. I remember receiving a couple of bottles years and years and years ago from that generation of your brewing, and for sure.
And so that was just an exploration of
Right.
can these beers be produced? I mean, at the time, people didn't even know if they could be like made in the U.S.
Right.
or can it only be made in this certain region.
And that was the point where you all, Jester King and others were, of course, Allagash had shown, but the Allagash is also at a really high latitude and has very cold winters and a much more Belgian-ish, kind of environment. And there were still lots of folks who weren't convinced that spontaneous beer could be made anywhere else.
Certainly, I mean, we knew that Allagash was doing it, and they had built up their cool ship room, and I think there might have been some early releases out of that program, but it was still very uncertain on if cool shipping would work in the U.S. And here in Wisconsin, we have a similar climate. We're very close to what a Belgian season looks like. We probably have probably a month longer season than Belgium does. So actually for us, the question later became not if you could cool ship, but how low of a temperature can you cool ship in? And there's one night it was negative 20 degrees and we were cool shipping, and it was like, well, will this work? Was it going to pick up enough? Is what's in the air at this temperature? It worked fine, but there was just a lot of uncertainty around spontaneous fermentation with the American brewing community, both professionally and as home brewers.
And so you started by working with another brewery who would brew the wort on their system, and then you would cool ship and ferment there in a kind of alternating proprietorship or contract kind of arrangement. But then you moved to open the Funk Factory Goozeria to have a kind of aging, blending, and retail space. Do you brew on site? I apologize, I've never been there, so okay.
Yeah, so that's the reason that Goozeria is in the name, is that we are a brewery. It's not Funk Factory Brewing. We don't brew. We're a blending facility. So I thought taking goose and the area ending, that's Latin based, or I spent some time in Latin America, in Spain and Costa Rica. Spain obviously is in Latin America, so I know that.
Yeah.
But anyway, I had like
A gooseria
some
sounds
time.
fun. Yeah.
I had some time with Spanish, and so I
Right.
made the amalgamation of words to best represent what I thought this brewery was, what it was, what our operations would look like, what the purpose of it was. So yeah, finding breweries that would brew wort um, and just sell us the wort was initially. It wasn't that hard of a challenge actually. Most breweries, their bottleneck is not their brew house. Their bottleneck is fermenters or packaging capability. So if you ask somebody, hey, can you brew a batch of this recipe, and I'll take it right after it leaves the boil kettle, they're like, yeah, sure, we'll make a couple bucks here. Great.
And then you tell them
And
you need a turbid mash, and
yeah, yeah,
and then their shift brewer is like, "Hey, who agreed to this?"
yeah. So yeah, took uh, the Cantillon turbid mash recipe and translated it to the gallons and Fahrenheit, and um, started working with that, and we've had to adjust that because of water hydration. Some of those steps don't make sense.
Let's talk about that a little bit. I
That.
mean, I think that's an interesting one. Obviously the smartest place to start is using that traditional Belgian lambic recipe with a heavy wheat component and this turbid mash, and trying to, produce this kind of highly dextrinous, hard, difficult to ferment kind of wort that'll allow that kind of fermentation process to be very slow and ongoing. But at the same time, you're also trying to produce beer that ultimately creates flavors that you find interesting, pleasurable, and engaging, for consumers. And so, with the local fauna and microflora of your own region to create something that's of your place. How over the number of years did you tweak that kind of recipe and some of the technical processes to better fit the kind of beer that you wanted to make?
Yeah, we haven't actually tweaked the recipe at all. It's just adjusting it for modern and modern brew systems.
Okay.
I mean, if you are supposed to put in X gallons in your first step and then pull out X gallons and there's nothing to pull out, that means you need to add more water to that first step.
Yeah.
So adjusting the steps in the turbid mash recipe is all that we've had to do to just like physically make that recipe work on the system. But we've dealt with many different issues in that recipe, and it isn't so much changing the recipe, it's preparing the breweries that this is going to go wrong and you're going to have to figure it out. So preparing them so the mash doesn't get stuck, or we've broke the rakes at 3 or 4 different breweries. So that's a very common, if you try to do this first edition and run your rakes, it's going to shear the pin and it's going to get messed up. So that trying to prepare for those kind of issues as we've gained more knowledge and done it over the years. And usually for the first time that we do the recipe at the brewery, I kind of treat it as a throwaway batch. We either won't use the beer that comes out of it, or we'll use part of it, or we'll do like a quicker fermentation on that wort to create a different product that won't go into our lambic program. But it seems like every brewery needs to do it once, and then they figure out the little quirks on their system, and then they get figured out. works a lot better than this time.
Let's talk a little bit about ingredient selection, because what you brew with certainly does matter in terms of malt and hops and this kind of thing. Before we do that, 5 Star Chemicals and Supply is your leading provider of cleaning, sanitizing, and adjunct chemicals for breweries throughout North America and internationally. All products have been formulated with safety, equipment, material, and quality in mind. Interested in trying their products? Contact support at 5starchemicals.com to inquire about a free craft brew sample pack and only pay the shipping. Just mention that you heard it here on the podcast. Cheers to beer. Also, Yakima Valley Hops is your hop source, whether you're brewing 5 gallons or 5 barrels. Get all the hops you want when you want them. They source the highest quality hops from the Yakima Valley and premium growing regions around the world so that you have access to the largest hop portfolio possible, even hard to find varieties like Citra, Nelson Sauvin, and Galaxy. Homebrewers visit YakimaValleyHops.com, and wholesale accounts find them at SpotHops.com. So, of course, when we're talking about lambic style beers and spontaneous beers and that kind of Belgian tradition, quality ingredients matter. Aged hops tend to matter. Talk to me about some of that ingredient thought that went into this, and then how since again some of these are products. Certainly, aged hops is. Well, you can now buy from from hops brokers blends that include aged hops. Generally, becomes something that you have to create a program around yourself. Talk to me about kind of developing that ingredient process, for your beers, for the spontaneous beers.
Yeah, the ingredients are pretty simple. These are yeast-driven flavor beers. So the ingredients, obviously you want high quality ingredients, but for us it's pretty easy with Brees in our backyard to get locally malted whatever we want we can get from Brees easily. And then even we've had Wisconsin grown grain that was like small batch stuff that Brees malted for Central Waters, and we were buying some of their stuff. I think that it's an element, but again, these beers derive most of their flavor from the fermentation, from the yeast. So it's when you're doing these beers as compared to other beers, you're not viewing the flavor development and fermentation as a tweak process, right? This is something you're building, knowing that it's 18 months before you really start touching barrels, and you're building it for a 3-year aging process, and getting comfortable in what that means. I mean, there's charts you can find online about the different stages of lambic fermentation and what microbes are doing at different stages. And I think getting comfortable with that and internalizing that as you look at these beers and how they're going to ferment and develop and age is very important. Knowing that you make this beer and it ferments, and 3 months later it might taste like crap, but don't throw it away, because you're not even into phase 1 really. So it's just a very, very different way of creating beer, and a very different, like management. It's almost just like you're overseeing these barrels rather than brewing beer and packaging.
Right. Now, that doesn't imply that every single barrel works out and that everything is a success. Because that blending process becomes an important element of creating the finished beers that you release. How do you describe that process, all along the kind of lifespan of a barrel? You don't touch it for 3 months, but in that early kind of, on that earlier 6 month, 9 month kind of getting a feel for where things are, how do you know something is on a right track? And what are some of the warning signs that something may be going a little bit off the rails, or may not be, creating something that you're going to be happy with?
So, hops are a very important ingredient in these beers. Using aged hops and whole cone aged hops I don't use the pellets. Pellets I've only been burned on the few times what we've used it. We've dumped everything.
Wow.
So I do not recommend using pellets. I think there is maybe BSV, somebody is taking aged cones and pelletizing it. Maybe that works for people. But it's just not a risk when you're aging a beer for 3 years. It's not a risk that I'm looking to try to save a little bit of time and effort using pelletized hops over whole cone. But as far as development, I mean, we don't touch barrels we don't touch them at the 6 or 9 month mark. The earliest we would touch them is at a year, just to start assessing where that year, that vintage is. Probably the earliest we actually are using barrels is 18 months. We might use earlier barrels in like a 3-year blend. We would use some barrels that are good. What you're looking for is that hops bitterness to fade out. And it'll take that first year and sometimes longer. What you will find in some that if this isn't going well is they just taste really bad. Like it could be kind of phenolic.
Yeah.
That will taste bad, but that's fine. Like that'll age out. Those barrels are some of the best ones to age out. But if it's like putrid,
yeah,
which we have
solventy or
we really haven't experienced that. I've experienced it at other breweries, barrel stock. Like I've gone in to help breweries see where they're at.
Right.
And it's just like, oh man, these are all bad, double. And so you got to learn like what flavors will age out and what flavors won't. And that kind of like green apple flavor, once that starts appearing, the barrels aren't bad, but use them. Use them as a very small percentage of a bigger blend, or maybe find that barrel that's old that has like a really intense flavor, and maybe those will blend together. But those, if it's an old barrel with that green apple, like those are, we just dumped some actually.
Yeah.
We had a brandy barrel, 9 brandy barrels that were aged lambic, and it just got that green apple flavor that we know won't age out.
Yeah.
So I think the interesting thing about blending that people don't understand, like you drink these end products and you think that, okay, even if you understand blending is a component here to create consistency, people don't really understand that a barrel on itself is very, very, very rarely good by itself. It's always missing something that you want more of some other character. It's too strong in this way that it's pretty rare to come across a barrel that's like this one by itself is really good. And when we do find those, we try to like grab one of them and package it off as a solo project. But
one of the things I love, in talking to blenders, and Lauren Limbach was a great example of this in New Belgium. She's got her notebook and she keeps track of each one of the foeders and barrels that they're tasting, and she's got her own shorthand and has developed her own language around that, and can with varying happy faces or sad faces or straight faces can define where any barrel or foeder might be at any stage in that kind of process. What does your kind of evaluative process look like? Is it just you? Do you work with a team of people? Do you guys communicate? Have you all built a language to describe how each one of these things might be behaving within your own sphere of utility?
I mean, for many years it was just me, and then now there's other people that help do this as well. Biggest one you're going through is you go through just a quick pass and measure acidity. Not even measure, like everything is sensory here, so we don't take any actual readings. But just where are your high acid, where are your low acid, and then where are your like high funk ones, and then taking little notes like this one has a stronger minerality, or this one has like maybe like a slight phenol to it. Just assessing kind of the range of barrels and across the different years, and then from there start saying, okay, well, this one that's a little lower in acidity, we blend it with these over here that are a little higher in acidity, and this one that is, is usually acid and the like funkiness of a barrel don't almost never. I don't think I've ever had a barrel that's high acid and high
Huh.
funk. Those are kind of mutually exclusive. So finding those two ends of the spectrum, and then saying, okay, these are the ends that need to get balanced. And then here's, this one is like a nice peach stone fruit flavor in this barrel, and this one is maybe it's more vinous of a barrel, and so then you're blending to stack flavors on top of each other after you've done the broad picture of balancing the barrels. And especially if you're going to take this blend and go into fruiting, then you're saying, well, I think these characteristics as a blend are going to go well with this fruit.
Right. For beers that you release consistently, do you have broad definitions for what those blends, what you want them to taste like, so that you can steer barrels in that kind of direction? I mean, I'm thoroughly fascinated with that kind of bourbon blend and whiskey blending process, where the same mash bill, aged in the same kinds of barrels, just at different places and different times of year, can produce wildly different bourbons. But then, each they blend to a flavor profile, and barrels get moved into certain kinds of brands because they taste a certain way. And I love that idea, potentially, and even, classic lambic brewers like Dreifonteinen take that barrel stock and will push different flavor profiles into a brand like Armand Gaston, Cuvée Armand Gaston, versus something like Oud Gouze. How do you think about what your brands taste like, and how you want those different expressions, to come through?
No, there isn't any like set rigorous box that we're shooting
Yeah.
for. If we're making Frampars, it's not like the base blend needs to look like this, and then we put purple raspberries in. It's we don't. Uh, there's way too much. There's way too many components that go into
Right.
it to try to be rigorous about these beers. It's very very different than normal fermentation and what we'd say regular beer. Um, and then even when it comes to fruiting, so after you're blending, uh, we work with locally grown fruit. So if it was a dry summer, it's those fruits are from the same farm, same hill, same plants.
Sure. Sure.
Year over year, those berries are going to taste different. So working with the seasonality of the local fruit as well. I think that for these beers, yes, you're blending to create balance and some consistency, and we certainly have like our fingerprint uh, on blending. I think our blends typically are higher funk and a little more dirty, maybe than some other American brewers that are going to be more like citrusy, bright, clean.
Yeah.
And I like that depth. Then you stack fruit on it. I want that, but I also don't want a uniform product year over year. Like that's part of the beauty of these beers, is that they're an expression of this time that it took to age it, and then this season of fruiting, and this beer, this vintage of this beer is going to be different than the vintage the following year.
That is the kind of interesting challenge in this, and it's the same challenge that winemakers face. Using the similar fruit that's still going to change year over year, trying to create a through line through those brands that where consumers have some expectation, but also understanding and embracing that kind of seasonal change and year over year vintage kind of change that will also shift. It is an interesting challenge that you face, trying to both have an idea for what you're doing, but also allowing the kind of natural movement of flavors, ingredients, and culture and everything else that kind of happens year over year. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about fruit, since you brought it up. And I swear after this, we can talk about some Untitled Art beers and not just talk about spontaneous and wild and sour beers. But first, ABS Commercial is excited to be a part of today's podcast. ABS is a full brewery outfitter offering brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts. ABS wanted to do something fun for the craft beer industry, so they're giving away an ABS Keg Viking keg washer live on December 5th, which also happens to be National Repeal Day. To enter, go to www.abs-commercial.com, click on Keg Viking page, and fill out the contest form for your chance to win. Also, if you enjoy this podcast and want to support our mission to bring you valuable insights from the world's best brewing minds, Craft Beer and Brewing's all-access subscriptions are the best way to do it. Get a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, a special deep dive email, and more. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and join now. So when it comes to adding fruit into your lambic style spontaneous beers, or lambic and goose style spontaneous beers, what does that kind of process look like? I obviously know that for different fruits you may treat them differently. Are you fruiting in barrels or in wood? Do you fruit in stainless? Are you working through kind of punch down processes? What does that typically look like for you to kind of get the extraction that you're looking for, while also keeping that beer and that re-fermentation alive?
I view it like you age the beer, and once the beer is mature, then you do your fruiting. So we don't do fruiting in the barrels. We don't do fruiting during the aging or during the early stages of these beers. You wait until you have mature beer, and if you're doing blend, lambic world, even if it's like Mertz, and a foeder product, you would wait until the foeder is mature. Then you pull off and you do fruit treatments afterward. And
are there specific techniques that you use while fruiting in order to kind of get the right kind of extraction out of fruits?
And so we do all of our fruiting in we use IBC totes. Mm-hmm. It's something I picked up from the cider world. They use IBC totes all the time. And they're great. It's about a 10-barrel tank that you can dispose of if you need to. They're cheap and readily available, and for the relatively short time that the beer sits on fruit, they're perfect for us. They can stack. So most of the time we're fruiting in totes, and then we've done some punch down beers, and those are in barrels with the heads removed, turned upright. I like the punch down. I like the pump over beers as well. Well, fruiting techniques. There's these different fruiting techniques from the wine world that we're really drawing on as we're doing our fruiting, because it's very, very similar goals.
Do you find yourself, what does the fruit itself look like? Are you using fresh whole fruit? Do you find with certain things that you prefer frozen fruit? Are there cases on this side where you may use puree? When you prep those whole fruits, what does that typically look like in terms of, pitting, stones, etc.?
For raspberries, it is whole fruit that has been frozen. The farmer, they fill 5-gallon barrels and throw it in the freezer, and then we get it from them and we let it thaw out, put it in beer. So it goes through a freeze-thaw cycle there. And then for cherries, we've done mostly just right from the tree into the beer. We don't go through freeze-thaw on those. For peaches and apricots, we will take the pits out, but we wait till the fruit is very ripe. So you should just be able to grab it and like rip it open with your hands, and the pit will separate. You don't need a knife. If you're using a knife to process peaches, like wait a couple days. Blueberries are whole fruit, freeze thaw cycle on those.
Are there any?
Yeah, most of, we don't use any purees for the lambic side. Yeah.
Are there any horror stories or fantastic results stories that that have been learning processes for you? On the fruit addition side, something that caught you off guard, either in a positive or negative way.
The first time that I did punch down was it was a big learning exercise, but it was the result of it was so like surprising how good this was.
Interesting. And what
we did it with black cap raspberries that Forager Brewing foraged, and I never will understand how they can collect that many fruit, how they collect that much fruit from the wild, the wilderness. They're just walking around the forest. So I'm glad that they did that, because it's not something I can figure out. But that.
How would you describe the difference in flavor from a prior generation of without a punch down versus this kind of punch down process?
So for that beer, we did the punch down mostly because it was such a small batch that it just made sense that's the batch size it had to go into, or the vessel it had to go into. But comparing traditional, where you just put the fruit in the beer and let it ferment for 2-3 months, versus a punch down. Punch down is much faster, so you're pretty much only doing it during active fermentation. I mean, you're only punching it down during active fermentation. And then you might let it sit for a week or two after that to continue infusing the flavor. Where if I did the same raspberries in a tote in a batch, you'd be waiting 3 months for it to all have fermented and fallen out, that kind of stuff. So it's much faster. The fruit, I feel like the fruit flavor, like the jamminess of the fruit, expresses more in a punch down.
Brightness and intensity, or
I feel like the sharpness and the acidity of the fruit is mellower in punch downs, though they do tend to also pick up some acidity from the oxygen exposure. So there isn't a ton of oxygen exposure, but after packaging, it picks up some.
It's still fermenting, and so it's scrubbing some oxygen as it goes.
Yeah.
Well, let's pivot here and talk about the Untitled Art side of the business. Talk to me about the formation of Untitled Art. Now clearly your first foray was in the Funk Factory side of creating a spontaneous and wild beer, but at some point you decided that you also wanted to create beer and other kinds of styles and started the Untitled Art brand. Talk to me about the formation of that and the kind of creative idea behind it.
So I drink other styles of beer than just spontaneous beer. So I like a wide variety of styles, and a lot of my time at festivals for when it was just Funk Factory, you meet other brewers in the industry, become friends with them, and you like their beers. I see what's going on the East Coast, what's going on the West Coast, what's going on. Down in Florida, they're always doing something silly, so you see what's going on down there.
Those silly
And
Floridian brewers. Yeah.
yeah. And
Can we put more
then
fruit in it?
come
Yeah,
back home.
Florida did it.
Yeah. And then come back home, and there just was a lack of, what I want to say, creativity or exploring in beer on this like front edge
Right.
of beer development. And so for a while I was trying, skip that. So I talked to Octopi Brewing here in town, where I was already working with them to get wort for Funk Factory.
And they're a contract brewery primarily in Madison.
Yeah. Yep. And I talked to him and just proposed, like, what if we started a different label and made the styles of beers that a Gooseria should not be making. and my hope was that we would just have an example of these styles for the Midwest. For initially, I just thought Wisconsin. And so that's what we set off to do, is just, what is a New England IPA? Because it doesn't exist in Wisconsin. So let's make that. Every style, trying to go through the, pastry stouts and Florida Vice and all these oddball styles, these new beer styles that are coming up. I see them at festivals. I see people excited about these. I like them. I want to drink these without having to. Again, I didn't want to pay for shipping. I started doing lambic because I didn't want to pay for shipping from Belgium. I don't want to pay for shipping from the East Coast to drink a juicy IPA. So let's just start a brewery.
Fair enough. Yeah.
That's how it started. And then it also became this awesome collaboratory outlet for me. At Funk Factory, we don't have the ability to do a lot of collaborations because we're so niche in what we do, and we're very, very small. So it became a way to say to my friends who were doing different styles, like, hey, come on up. We can hang out and make a beer up at this playground of a facility. And so that was the start of Untitled Art. And then there was a art festival in Florida that reached out to us. I got an email one day from Untitled Art Fair, and I was like, oh great, here's my cease and desist, right? And inside, it turned out that one of the ladies that was running it is from Madison, and her dad had sent her a picture of our beer and asked if it was her. She was like, oh. Then she reached out to us saying, we love the brand. We have the same name. Like, would you guys be interested in sponsoring the art fair? And so that's what started our distribution out of state, or even thinking about selling outside of the state. And we found a great distributor in Florida that has grown and grown.
So you went from taking some of these creative styles and being inspired by some of this development that was happening in other parts of the country and wanting to bring that back to your local market, and then kind of dialed those in and started, figuring them out and creating some compelling examples of these, and then started shipping them back out and distributing. And now, what does that distribution footprint look like for Untitled Art? How far out do you all get with the Untitled Art beer?
We currently have 23 states.
Wow.
And there's a little bit that goes overseas as we have availability, but.
About how much volume are you producing per year for Untitled Art?
Good amount.
A good amount? It's top secret, huh?
I like the cloak that we have
All right, all right, fair
with
enough.
Octopi. Like they have their what they make, but I like the
Yeah,
cloak that we have. And so
that's all right. I wanted to ask, but I respect your your secrecy there. Talk to me. You have a bit of a unique approach to distribution. When it comes to most ways that distribution happens in the country, beer brands will sell distribution rights to distributors. The franchise laws in those states tend to then be pretty strict in governing those kinds of relationships. But you've tried to focus on taking a different avenue and approach to that. Talk to me a little bit about that.
yeah, I mean, I've always had this pessimistic attitude towards distributors, or not so much the distributors, but the structure that breweries are forced to work with when working with distributors. And so when I started Untitled Art, my goal in the beginning was to give Octopi the recipe and then sign a local Wisconsin distributor, and the beer just goes from Octopi to the distributor, and I just sit back and do nothing and get a paycheck. That'd be great.
Sure.
But the
Living the dream.
yeah, the week before our first beer was to be packaged, the distributor who we were almost about to sign with sent back a revision of the agreement, and it took out all the little special things that we, like here's where we want the marketing budget, blah blah. They took it all out, everything that we had talked about, and they knew it's like, well, you guys are packaging next week, so take it or leave it. And in Wisconsin, you can self-distribute, so I said, leave it. We got some friends to help drive Penske rental trucks and sell and deliver the first batch. Then ever since then, that pessimism that I've had of distributors was really solidified. And so we self-distributed for a long time. And then as we looked to different states, I wanted to make sure franchise rights were not going to prohibit our movement and growth and needs in the future for whatever reason, and I can talk about different reasons that have come up, but we for every state we'll go in and find their state statute that creates franchise rights and put that in the contract and say we're operating outside of this, and that I don't have to prove just cause or whatever they say for terminating the agreement. And then I set the value of the brand. We agree it's set at $1. So that's the only contracts that I'm willing to sign. And I believe that it creates a fair and level playing field for breweries and distributors. This relationship, it's insane to me that for the beer world only, franchise rights are written into state statute. It's not just a common thing in the industry that distributors want it in their contracts that they sign with breweries. This is in state statute. This is insane to me.
It's
Wineries don't do it.
The power of lobbying,
Yeah.
and the power of special interest kind of, pushing for that kind of thing. And, to be fair, at the time that most of those laws were pushed through, you had a small number of producers and a large number of small local family-owned distributors. And all of those small local family-owned distributors were fearful that the large mega brands were going to pull their business and leave these small distributorships hanging. And so they worked legally to accomplish that. Now, the script is completely flipped now, as consolidation has just ripped through the distribution market, and now we have so few distributors in most markets, and so many small breweries, and now you have these large distributorships that are taking advantage of the three-tier requirements for breweries to sell through them in order to even reach consumers in a lot of states, and also taking advantage of these incredibly strong franchise laws that were designed in a different era to protect for a different reason, but have not been adjusted on any of those state books since. So, you're absolutely right.
It's a model that does not make sense for craft breweries.
Right.
It makes sense if you're the distributor for Anheuser-Busch and you don't want them to just one day decide they're going to go to a different distributor, and you have this massive infrastructure that you've built with staff and delivery vehicles and warehousing and all the technology that's behind it. Yeah, certainly that should be protected, but that, again, is very easy to do in a contract, sans state statute. You don't need the government to be involved in this contract. So,
but that's a nice way of working together to, find the people that you partner with and say, we're not going to try to get a whole bunch of cash out of you up front for the rights to these. And in return, we want you to perform for us, and we want to produce beer that you sell for us. And we will both, set this contractual expectation around how we're going to work with each other, and renew that where it may, when it makes sense for us, and potentially not renew that when it doesn't make sense or it stops making sense for either one of us. And make sure, everyone in any kind of business relationship wants to feel that the people that they're working with are responsive and have an incentive to continue to, promote each other and work with and for each other. And the franchise laws tend to kill some of that and give all the leverage to one side of the equation and none to the other. What have been some of those situations where you found that this type of contract has been a useful thing? And have there been any also some situations on the other side where it may not have been the ideal way to to have structured that relationship?
I'm not gonna name who the distributors are.
Absolutely.
But so there's been instances where a distributorship closes, goes out of business, just because they're out of business and not actively selling your brand and distributing your product does not mean that their rights to your brand goes away as well. So if we didn't have the contract that we have, that distributor closes, and we want to go to a different distributor, that new distributor or we would have to buy our brands back from an entity that's
an asset in their bankruptcy filing that then that they own, which is kind of insane for you trying to operate a business and sell things.
So we're able to switch. We've had to do this twice. A distributorship no longer exists, and we need to find the replacement distributor for that state or that territory. And we're able to do it very fast, and a lot of times without any hiccups in the market. But that's only because our contract allows for that. There's been times where personnel change happens at the distributorship, and the person who used to handle our brand, that used to be one of their accounts, that salesperson, that person left, and the new person's taken over, or maybe it's a couple different people, and our brand got lost in the mix, right? And we noticed, they didn't buy anything from us this month, and the next month they didn't either. This is weird. So if a distributor in this case, they just kind of forgot, right? But if a distributor for some reason chose not to sell your brand, you have to buy your brand back from them. Or a new distributor has to say that it's worth the investment for them to purchase the brand rights from the distributor who doesn't want to handle your stuff anymore. heard from friends in the industry that have gone through this process. Uh, Buying your brand rights for a territory can cost more than it cost the brewery to start the whole brewery. You know, it's it's, uh, it's kind of a. I think it's an insane structure that breweries have to operate in. So this isn't just me saying I want to be able to leave willy nilly from a distributorship who's otherwise working. This
Right.
is only if there is a problem. And and personally, I think if you're out there doing your job and if you believe you're the best distributor in that territory, then there's never going to be a problem, right? Maybe you sign 10 more brands and now you're not focused on that one brand that used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Clearly, with 23 states in your footprint, it hasn't proven to be to hurt your ability to find distributors that are willing to work that way. It also seems like it may give a leg up, especially to smaller craft distributors who may not have six figures in their bank account to buy brand rights, in order to get started on something like that. And I'm using six figures as a just broad, but it can be expensive, and what some, craft beer brands will ask for, in order, for those rights can be rather expensive and prohibitive for some of, some smaller distributors. And so in that way, it also potentially creates another line of products that some smaller craft distributors can then sell. Have you found that that's actually helped the growth of the brand?
We have worked with both, or we currently work with both big distributorships that have that kind of bank funding and could purchase our brand for six figures, whatever. And we work with very, very small distributors who maybe they just started in the last year.
Have there been any downsides to this kind of arrangement outside of the fact that Untitled Art as a brand is not necessarily able to sell brand rights and take the capital potentially raised from selling those brand rights and put it into the kind of to fund growth of the brewery, that is for a lot of small craft breweries a way that they are able to fund growth outside of kind of debt financing or equity funding. You trying to grow it in a different way becomes a little more challenging. I would, from my vantage point, suspect that that relationship with Octopi and the fact that the beer is being brewed there does scale down some of the capital requirements for your brewery to grow. But how has that affected Untitled Art's growth otherwise?
Yeah, I think that there's cases where breweries have sold their brand rights to fund growth, um, and that has worked out well for them. But there's also a number of cases where they sold their brand rights to fund the new development, and you know what? That new distributor is selling 60% of what you were selling, what you were self-distributing, and you built a brewery to double what you're capable of doing. And it becomes a burden. You no longer own your own brand rights. Yeah, I think you'd be much better off selling equity in the brewery and owning your brand rights, or just don't get into a situation where they own your brand rights. But then you can't sell the brand rights to. Yeah, I I don't know. I feel like as soon as you sell those rights to somebody and you can't get out of it without a huge financial hurdle, they own as much of your brewery as you think you do. So
Sure, sure. Let's talk about building a brand like Untitled Art. It's in this current craft beer environment, local, and this connection to the people making the beer and this story of local beer has become a very powerful way for small craft breweries to sell beer. You're still a small craft brewery, but are taking a different approach. It is more about the product and it's about the brand position and presence and aesthetic, and then the beer in the package with this, as you mentioned, this kind of cloak or veil between, that direct, details about the brewery itself and the end brand. It's a different kind of way to create an idea around craft beer. Doesn't make there's no wrong or right method. It's just an interesting, different aesthetic approach. How has Untitled Art found ways to connect with consumers across 23 states without this kind of traditional network of brand representatives and marketing folks and
Yeah.
pint nights and all of the other means by which craft breweries tend to build brands?
Yeah. In some sense, by complete accident. It was very intentional that the branding of Untitled has been very, very intentional. I felt exhausted, to know this brewery's IPA, I gotta know this cartoon character and gotta remember that name to know that this one is an IPA, the other cartoon character is a stout, and it becomes hard to keep it all put together. And then also, as a producer, if you're that brewery, you got to keep coming up with these different characters for your cans and for your beers, and you have to find the name and the backstory and you're building these characters essentially as part of your brand. And so I wanted to do away with that. Also, breweries write a big description on the beer, like it was made with this and went through this process and aging, and a lot of times you see they're using, hey, we made an IPA, it has Galaxy hops and it has whatever. You're writing a description saying the ingredients and also saying it tastes like this to influence the consumer, so that when that person drinks it, they look for, if you say, oh, this is a grapefruit bomb of IPA, it could taste nothing like grapefruit by the time it actually hits that customer, but they're going to review it tasting for grapefruit, and they're going to taste grapefruit even though it might not be there. And so you're skewing the consumer's understanding of what your product is, and intentionally, for the purpose of getting a higher Untappd score, or for the purpose of dropping some keywords to sell more volume, or whatever it is. And so it goes back to why we started. I wanted to just bring these styles that are being done at the forefront and the periphery of beer. I wanted to bring them to the general consumer. And I don't think that I need to say anything more than, I'm looking over the shelf, pineapple upside down sherbet. That's all we say for that beer. I don't give you any description of the product. The name of the beer is just that. We don't give any of our beers names. We name it the style. We don't put any description on our beers. At first, I didn't even put alcohol percent. I didn't, because we don't legally have to in Wisconsin. I wouldn't put if it had lactose, which obviously that was like a quick change I made because I'm lactose intolerant.
Right.
But I understand, there's allergens. Okay, so we list all the allergen stuff. And we list ABV because we sell in many states now. But it is scaled down to just the bare bones information that you need. We did start putting the hops varieties on our IPAs because we would do versions. So we'd do like a juicy IPA and version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so to help people know which can is which, we would put at the bottom version 1 and it's this hops. But other than that, we don't disclose any information about the beer other than what is felt to be absolutely necessary. And maybe it's because I also had no financial pressure with this brand. This is all just kind of for fun, right? I I didn't care if it sold super well. Yeah, right?
Well, all
Like,
right, then there's that.
yeah. Meaning like I don't want to write this exhaustive description and tasting notes for a product just to sell more volume, right? Like I think the beer can just stand on its own. And if you open it up and you think that this stout tastes like chocolate, or if you open it up and think it tastes like coffee, like that, like good. That's what you should do. That's how I got into beer. Like we would open beer, blind tastings were a
Sure,
thing.
sure.
You drink the beer and think about it. Just drink it, whatever. You're eating a meal, you're drinking a beer, having a glass of wine, whatever it is. Just like instead of consuming that thing without thinking about it, this forces people to think about it a little more. Um, and on the flip side, it made my life a lot easier because I don't have to come up with unique characters every time or write a tasting note description on it every time. Um, so that was great, part of the branding. But yeah, it has no identity then, right? So uh, as I talk to other breweries who are starting their brewery or launching a different side brand, um, this is not this is like opposite of the advice I give people. It's all about creating that connection to a consumer, right? And for Untitled Art, I took the opposite way. I was like, this is going to be void of any connection, right? The only appealing part is the artwork that we dress the cans with, and that's super fun working with artists to create artwork that feels like the beer without having any proper nouns in the artwork. If it's a peach sour, like you can't draw peaches, right?
Right.
Um,
The whole thing, I don't know, are
so
you familiar with the comedian Bill Hicks? He, has that fantastic bit on marketing and advertising. And I won't get into it too much, but there was this moment where he's like, I know the marketing and advertising people in the audience are like, ooh, he's taking the anti-marketing and advertising approach. That's going to do well. Like even your reaction to this world of marketing, brand building becomes its own effort in brand building. It's just a completely opposite approach for that. But it is also interesting in the same way that, modern artists, especially abstract expressionists, worked to push the hand of the artist out of the work
yeah,
itself. And it became this conscious effort on the part of these creators to pull, that kind of direct human connection and let the things stand on their own. The question that I have though is like, what makes somebody to grab it off a shelf,
I know that's what you're
that
saying.
like
Yeah,
it's
so
there, it's
that's
in
what I
a
say is
case,
the
it's
accident.
against, like there's pretty pictures on the
Yeah,
label, but there's pretty pictures on it. Like everyone's got pretty good looking labels these
yep,
days. Like
yep.
as a
And
consumer,
so
like why do I grab that one? Why do I, buy that one when it's there?
and that's where I say it's been a happy accident because um, people in Wisconsin do not know that Untitled Art is a Wisconsin brand. People in Texas don't know it's a Texan brand. It has no identity. So, which should go against us, right? It should be viewed as like a Costco brand or something, right?
Yeah.
But instead, everybody views it as their hometown brand. And I don't know why. But it's awesome. Like I'm happy for it, but it's definitely I don't know how to recreate that. I don't know how to advise somebody on a branding strategy that would do the same thing.
It's almost Mark Rothko-esque in the way that the viewer becomes a part of the work, and their experience of it becomes the thing that, and the thing that it is. It's been an interesting approach, and
I was
novel.
I was standing in line at a taco truck a couple years ago, and it was in front of a bottle shop, and some girl ahead of me had a can of Untitled Art and was talking to her friend, and her friend was like, "Did you know this is made in Wisconsin?" Like, did you know this was made here? She was like, oh my gosh, no way. Like, and I'm just standing right behind her and we're like, this is perfect. This is
Well,
exactly.
yeah, it's funny that we actually haven't talked about the specific beers or hard seltzers that you make, all of which are actually rather interesting, and which, we here at Beer and Brewing Magazine have grown quite fond of. We may have to do that another time, though, because we're starting to run out of time. Way we typically end the podcast is with a question.
Hold on, I'm gonna jump in there though, because you made a comment earlier, like about the seltzers, and it's kind of this like sheepish territory that you don't want to get into, or not that you don't want to get in, but I think like your audience is sheepish about it. It's viewed as this like the black sheep of beering right now, of beer and brewing right now.
In fairness,
Right?
I did an entire episode with Chris Colby, who authored How to Brew Hard Seltzer a couple weeks ago, and we haven't shied away with it. And we've got a whole issue in our 2021 lineup on dedicated to Beyond Beer. Because I do think that it is interesting. There is a craft approach to this. It is something that craft brewers should not feel embarrassed about, even though as we have these conversations, there are plenty of craft brewers listening to this who will argue with me on that point. And I will accept that and be fair about it. But from your standpoint, as somebody that makes spontaneous lambic inspired beer,
Yeah.
and then also has this Untitled Art brand brewing hazy IPAs and hyper fruited kettle sours, and also
There's a Kool-Aid beer coming out this week. It's a different flavor. It's a different product. It's a different creation. But I think what I would say is that no matter what you're making, I think for Funk Factory, it's hard to explore other styles because we're so niche into this one style. And there's other breweries that are, you might be known to be a German brew house, right? Like you only do German styles, whatever it is, right? But for most breweries who you're already making IPAs and stouts and fruit beers and whatever, right? Like why, I don't understand why a brewery would shy away from seltzers. I think White Claw is disgusting because of the flavors that they add to it. It tastes very artificial to me. But the seltzer base, like as a fermented product, right? That is technically beer. I agree. It looks nothing like beer in the brewing process, in the creation of it. But like, I think breweries need to understand this is a new base. Just like when West Coast breweries swore they would never make New England IPAs,
Sure.
And they fought it and fought it and fought it. But what are they doing now? Like
Yeah.
you can't like, it's the most recent iteration of an evolution in beer that a certain group of breweries are going to write off and say this is not beer. But you know what? I bet you that 90% of the beer that brewery makes, at some point in history, there was another group of brewers that said that is not beer.
All beer is hard seltzer, right? Not all hard seltzer is beer, but all beer is hard seltzer. What does success ultimately look like for Funk Factory and for Untitled Art? How do you define it? What do you have an end goal in mind? What would you define success as?
I think they're very different for Funk Factory and Untitled Art. Funk Factory is a passion project. It's never been about a financial success. So just seeing it exist is the success. For Untitled Art, it's initially it was let's just create examples, even if it's like a B to the best example, if it's not quite there, but it's an example. Let's just create it and make it accessible for people. And then it's become we can really make these very well. So we're making these styles, but we're making it at a tier that we're emulating, right? So it's become the perfect emulation of the very exciting styles of beer. And then now it's to create the next wave, create the styles that haven't been created yet.
The styles that haven't been created yet. What's next after seltzer? We're going to have to talk about that more at another date, but I can't wait to see what you come up with, Levi. Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Get Haze for Days with Carry BioHaze from BSG. Inquire about a free craft brew sample pack from 5 Star Chemicals and Supply. Yakima Valley Hops is your hop source, whether you're brewing 5 gallons or 5 barrels. ABS Commercial is giving away a Keg Viking Keg Washer live on December 5th. And Craft Beer and Brewing's all access subscriptions are the best way to support this very podcast. Levi, if people want to learn more about Funk Factory or Untitled Art, where should they go to find more out about you?
Oh, social media, right? That's where everything is now. So Instagram and Facebook are mostly what we do. At Untitled Art Bev is Untitled Art. At Funk Factory is Funk Factory. At Funk Factory Pizzeria.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a spot.
Well, check them out. If you're in one of the 23 states in the distribution footprint, grab one of the Florida Vice hard seltzers. It has been one of our favorites this year in the entire hard seltzer space, and we've published to that effect in the magazine before. We recently tasted the cherry pie sour a la mode, sour cherry pie a la mode. Really loved that beer, and of course, you can read reviews of Funk Factory beers and in previous issues of Craft Beer and Brewing too. Levi Funk, Funk Factory, and Untitled Art. Thanks for joining me on the podcast. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.